in the Biden administration, it's been quite interesting to see on our other topic of sole authority, presidential sole authority. This has actually been an issue that's been gaining some traction in terms of public attention and the news media. And that is definitely in part due to our former President Trump really brought a lot of attention to this issue. So presidential sole authority is the basic stance that the United States has. Our policy when it comes to authority over who can order a launch of nuclear weapons is that that authority lies solely in the hands of the President of the United States. And it's important to understand that it's not just the president's authority to launch nuclear weapons, it's also their only authority in that no one can countermand them. No one can say no. They cannot, they cannot deny a presidential order to launch nuclear weapons because they are the commander in chief, and inherently their order is a lawful order because it's ordered by the president. And this is an area where people tend to get a little confused by the minutia sometimes, and it is complicated because what it comes down to is that this is the policy, but how it would actually play out in real life is in some ways always going to be a question mark. And that's where people, I find, often get stuck. I say, oh, well, what if this happens, or what if that happens, or what if someone says no, even though they're not allowed to? Those are fair questions to ask. What happens when a president would order a nuclear launch? They would bring out what's called the nuclear football, which is a briefcase that travels with the president at all times. And within that briefcase is a communication device, as well as a number of folders that contain instructions and launch plans that you could basically pre-approved launch plans that the president could pick from, kind of like ordering from a Pizza Hut menu. Okay, I want, cheese, the pepperoni, and like green bell peppers, and you choose A, B, C, D, that have all been pre-vetted and planned out and drilled and run so that the military can execute it within minutes. And then the president also has a verification card. It's often called the biscuit. President's supposed to have this on their person at all times. It contains the verification code that would, when the briefcase is opened and the launch plan is picked, they would then communicate to the command center saying, okay, this is the president, here's my verification code from the biscuit so that you know that it's me. And this is the order that I would like to implement now. And then that order would then get passed down through the chain of command to the missileers, who would then implement the order. Often people say that the military would refuse an illegal order of launching nuclear weapons. And that is definitely an interesting question, because what constitutes a legal and lawful order? There is the principle of proportionality. So technically, within military regulations, you're not supposed to order an attack that is disproportionate from the scenario that you're facing. So yes, technically, just
that's illegal. That's okay.
So oftentimes people say, oh, this fear about a president launching a random nuclear missile in the middle of the night is unfounded, because the military would say, oh, you can't just launch a nuke at China right now. They haven't done anything. This isn't proportional. This is an illegal order. And that is true to an extent. However, it doesn't quite understand that, first of all, the president doesn't necessarily have to go through command. You can directly communicate to the launch teams, depending on, because this is meant to go so quickly, there are different avenues to do that. And secondly, it's actually not quite the real fear in this scenario. It is unlikely that that scenario would play out. I do think that the chances are that someone within the chain of command would most likely halt an order if it was something random like that. However, the bigger concern is in a heightened state. Say, for example, during the Fire and Fury debacle with President Trump and North Korea, when they were tweeting at one another and really exchanging all these fiery words. And everyone's on a higher alert. Everyone's waiting for something to happen. If an order were to go out under that sort of scenario, in a state where everyone is heightened and waiting for something to happen, because these orders are intended to implement as fast as possible, and that's how they drill this, that's how it is run in the military, is that you are supposed to not question your orders, you're supposed to implement them. And in fact, the missileers themselves, actually Radiolab does a fabulous episode called Nukes, where they dive into this question that I highly recommend.
I'll link to it for sure.
They asked this question of a former nuclear missileer who asked the question, how do I know that this is a lawful order when I get the order to launch nuclear weapons? And basically was forced out of the military for asking that question.
Damn.
That you are not allowed to ask this as a lawful order. That is above your pay grade. That you are just supposed to obey. And that's really what it's intended, that the military is not instructed or trained to question orders. The commander-in-chief is supposed to be followed, and particularly when it comes to nuclear weapons, because these are scenarios which are high stress, high response situations, they are intended to be answered as quickly as possible. And I find it interesting, there was a congressional hearing during Trump's tenure where they convened this whole question. It convened a bunch of experts to answer questions to Congress about, what is the extent of this authority? And former General Hyten came in and he said, this whole thing is overblown. It's not that big of a deal. We wouldn't obey an unlawful order if it wasn't proportional to the situation. But then he goes on to say, but what we would do is work with the president to find a lawful order that he could then implement. So that's the trick. Okay, maybe you wouldn't launch 100, but the question is, would you completely disobey the commander-in-chief from doing what they are supposed to do, which is have complete and total authority over our nuclear weapons? Maybe it's just a tactical nuke.
Yeah.
So
it's literally like going back to the Pizza Hut menu reference. It's like the generals are like, no, try our daily special instead. You don't, our salads have gone bad. Try this instead. That kind of vibe. It's like,
we're out of that one on the menu today, but
we got some fresh fish.
And that's the question, is that anyone who says that there's no reason we should change the presidential sole authority policy really comes down to, we are leaving this to a question of norms. Everyone is, I think this was one of the big lessons that lots of people took away from the Trump era, is that we have a lot of policies in the United States that are not inscribed in stone. They are held together by norms and expectations. We expect that a president would never launch a nuclear weapon inappropriately, because we think that would be crazy. That would be, hard to think of. But why would we allow that even to be a possibility?
Right.
Why wouldn't we just say that, no, let's make sure that this could never happen? Why would you leave any of that to chance? And we'll mention that they do mention this in the button, and we cover this in some of the episodes of the podcast. Episode 2 in particular, which really digs into this question. There have been other instances of presidents being really in a volatile situation when it comes to their usage and relationship with our nuclear arsenal. In particular, we have, Reagan's slide into dementia in his later years. There was discussions that they were trying to make sure that he couldn't have access to some of the football. Particularly Nixon was a very worrying situation. There are lots of reports that before he left office that he was drinking heavily, and that his Secretary of Defense actually tried to talk to NoRAD to say, if you get any launch orders, you need to come to me first, just in case. But the problem is he has no authority to do that.
Right.
There is no policy that says that would happen. So once again, they were putting in this, let me just put a pin in that, maybe this will hold enough if I just kind of lightly fix this with, there's a little bit of Scotch tape on this situation. So why would you leave that to chance at all? Why wouldn't you just inscribe this and definitely this cannot happen because it should never happen? And I mean, even with President Kennedy, with a quite well-documented experience with prescription painkillers, and as well as with alcohol, that at the number of times that there were high stress situations that he could have responded to in an altered state, that who knows what would have happened in those scenarios. There's so many instances we could have been just inches away from complete and total disaster.
Yeah.
So why wouldn't you remove that risk whatsoever?
Yeah. And you answered my next question. My next question was going to be, Trump is out of office. Why should we care that the president has this sole authority? And thank you for making that job easier.
Yeah. Well, I mean, on top of that is this was never an issue that the people who've been talking about this was never specifically about Trump. A lot of people think, it was getting a lot of popular attention because Trump was in office. So now you suddenly had news media people talking about it. But the people who've been talking about presidential sole authority have been talking about this well before and will continue to talk about it. So they say no individual should have this authority to do this. No one person should be able to make a decision without any democratic input that could potentially end all of civilization.
Yeah.
And there's some interesting discourse that has actually gone around talking about how presidential sole authority is actually anti-democratic, since it gives the power to the president to essentially start a war, which technically is supposed to be in the hands of Congress.
Yeah.
So that is both unconstitutional to have this be the policy in the first place. And I'll just make a quick note in the history of why we even have this policy, which is actually interesting. It comes down to all the way back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and President Truman, when the first nuclear weapons were used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nuclear weapons were under the purview of the military. They were the military's weapons to use as they saw fit. And Truman approved the missions, but there is actually some question to what extent he was fully aware of all the details. And the understanding is that when the news was coming back of the level of devastation and the number of casualties, that Truman panicked actually, and they had plans to continue bombing Japan. It's important to note that they actually had plans to launch in the coming days several other nuclear bombs at other locations in Japan. And Truman intervened, and he said, no more. I'm halting this entirely. I'm taking the authority away from the military. You do not have the authority to order the launch of these weapons anymore, and you cannot do it without my approval from here on out. And that was originally how this whole policy came into being, was actually to take the power away from the military to make sure that it had a civilian control over these weapons. So there is actually a great reason as to why this happened. The problem is that the policy never evolved from there. That was 75 years ago. Yeah. I think it's time to say, okay, maybe we should think about this a little bit longer. We have considered that maybe this isn't the best way to do it. The button proposes a couple of different solutions, and a lot of people have had different conversations about, what would this look like if we didn't have presidential sole authority? And there's different ways you can go about that. Some people have proposed, congressional approval. Some people say, just a small panel, a security panel. There are different ways to do it. It could even just be, 3 people. Mm-hmm. Although the constitutionality of that is still an issue. The bigger question is, you need to have someone who can respond in a quick situation. Once again, in the notion of, okay, an attack is happening now, what do we do? Right.
Or if the attack were to cut off communications and the president wasn't able to get in touch with a security council, then, then does the presidential sole authority become the path? I feel like there's so many scenarios to...
Yeah, so there are definitely conversations to be had there in the event of an attack. But once again, it comes back to this question of, do we really need to respond rapidly? And the answer is really no. With expediency, sure. Dilly-dallying is not necessary, but it doesn't need to be instantaneous. And in fact, it would really behoove us to maybe stop and consider, what are we doing when we're launching nuclear weapons back? Mm-hmm. Do we really want to start a nuclear war? Because that could potentially end all of civilization. And what better time to take a breath, think about it, have some discussions, for sure, and maybe have some opposing opinions before you make this decision that could potentially end life on Earth.
Yeah.